This is episode 93 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzgerald with the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore and University College Dublin in Ireland. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
It was called Making Ready, and it was also called Appareling. And the biggest part of this was really building the seating. Building the stage was pretty simple. It's a stage. But building the seating, these were like bleachers. They were raised seating so that the guests could be seated according to their order in the social hierarchy, and also so that they could have visibility so that they could see what was being performed.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For many of the performances we know Shakespeare performed at Whitehall Palace, including staging Twelfth Night in 1602, he would have performed at Banqueting House as part of Whitehall Palace. Unfortunately, the original Banqueting House burned down after Shakespeare died, and while it was rebuilt in 1622 by the famous Inigo Jones for James I, the structure there today is not the original site where Shakespeare's company would have performed. Nevertheless, the name Banqueting House reminds us that for Queen Elizabeth, the banquet was a large affair, full of all the pomp and circumstance you might expect from the Queen of England. After all, these state occasions were often used to welcome and entertain visiting dignitaries, as well as to mark special occasions, such as royal birthdays or the Christmas season. But what was Shakespeare's role at these banquets? We know he was there, but was he just a performer there to put on a play, or was he allowed to be a guest at the lavish dinners as well? And what were the standard aspects of a royal banquet in the 16th century that would have been seen and heard in the Palace of Whitehall or at Hampton Court Palace those years that Shakespeare was performing there? Here to take us back to Shakespeare's lifetime and help us experience the formal banquet through the eyes of Shakespeare is our guest, Julia Lupton. Julia Reinhard Lupton is the professor of English at the University of California, Irvine, where she co-directs the New Swan Shakespeare Center. She's the author and co-author of 5 books on Shakespeare, including Shakespeare Dwelling, Designs for the Theater of Life. She has also written 2 books about design with her twin sister, Ellen Lupton, DIY Kids and Design Your Life. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow and an award-winning teacher. Hello, Julia. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
During a formal court banquet, which came first, the meal or the entertainment?
Well, we're pretty sure that the meal would come first. We know that the Office of the Revels, which was an important court department, one of their main tasks was to hang the chandeliers that would provide enough lighting for a play to actually be performed. And that was a big job. It involved many workers and equipment and tallow and so forth. So the performances were at night, and they would have been most usually after the main large feast was over. But that didn't mean there wasn't more food to come, because we know that these plays were sometimes performed in banqueting houses, which were associated with sweetmeats and cordials and fruit and nuts, and this more informal kind of intimate dining that would occur after a masque or a play.
In Julia's book, she outlines the various courses which appeared during a banquet. And Julia, it seems as if these courses were presented with a kind of choreography in and of themselves, almost like the food was a production. Was there a particular order and fanfare to the presentation of the food at banquet events?
Absolutely. I mean, the feast itself was in many courses, at least 5 courses. There would have been very heavy courses to begin with, featuring meats roasted meats, but also meats and pies. And these pies, these were like architecture. Some of them were huge. Some of them had whole animals inside of them. Sometimes the pies had live animals inside them, such as frogs or birds that would hop out when the pie was opened. The pies could also be arranged to form, let's say, a crown. And then after the heavier meat courses, there would be a series of lighter courses. These courses also would really feature food that was symbolic, that was shaped, impressed with insignia, heraldic shapes, jellies, and other kinds of foods that would have a symbolic meaning. Taste was not necessarily the emphasis of the chef. It was really like, how do we communicate the royal family, the guests, the themes? It was very thematic and artistic, the way the food was presented. And each course would certainly be presented separately with a lot of servers, very dramatic, very much a sense of presentation.
So that old nursery rhyme of the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie, that really occurred, that the pie would
happened.
Be opened. Wow, that's
Absolutely.
impressive.
Yes, they loved spectacle and shock. The table itself was often very elaborately set to appear like a landscape. So there could be like a fortress in the center, perhaps created out of sugar, and then symbolic foods representing a garden around it. We have recipe books describing a stag, created out of some kind of pastry that would then be shot and start bleeding claret wine. So we really had these like theme parks at the center of the very great tables that were quite elaborate and were sort of telling little narratives. They were themselves like plays or masks.
Does the surviving banqueting house represent the kind of space which banquets would have been held in during Shakespeare's lifetime? And how is the current banqueting house that is actually there in London different from the Elizabethan one? Because it was rebuilt, I believe, after Shakespeare's lifetime.
Yeah, that's right. Well, banqueting, the word banquet really has two distinct meanings, one of which is how we use the term today to refer to a feast. The much more common meaning of the word banquet was to refer to a final course after the feast, often in a separate place, that consisted of cookies, fruit, candied fruit and fresh fruit, various kinds of jellies, conserves, and cordials that were also made from fruit. They were alcoholic and were considered to be medicinal, as well as, disinhibiting, make you tipsy. And so a banqueting house refers to a building that is not attached to the main palace, often that requires a short walk, that is set apart, and that is a little bit of a temporary structure. So the Elizabethan banqueting houses were created out of timber and then covered with canvas, and the canvas was painted. So in the interior of the banqueting house, the sides would be painted with pastoral scenes, and the ceiling would be painted with a beautiful sky. And so you were inside, you were protected from the elements, but it was as if you were outside, and it was a very light structure, not meant to be permanent, although they often stood for many years. And so when we talk about a banqueting house in the Elizabethan period, whether it's one of her banqueting houses or on the great house on an aristocratic estate, it really refers to one of these outbuildings. Some of them were quite large. And the very large ones could seat as many as 1,000 guests for a performance of a play or a masque. Now, the banqueting house that exists today at Whitehall is a permanent structure, and it was designed by Inigo Jones, who is a great classically trained architect, as well as a theater and stage designer, absolutely fascinating Renaissance man who worked for the court of James I. And that banqueting house is called a banqueting house, but it is a permanent structure. And the ceiling, for example, is painted by Peter Paul Rubens at great expense. And because plays required all these chandeliers, you could no longer have plays in that space because the smoke from the chandeliers would have ruined the Rubens paintings. And so you really see with that banqueting house, theater moves into small permanent theaters like the Cockpit, which were built inside the palace complex. So it's a little confusing, that word banqueting house, but if we look at it historically, it has very precise meanings that really give us amazing access to the ambiance of Elizabethan and Jacobean performance culture.
So it really is kind of a unique aspect of Shakespeare's life to have had plays performed in a banqueting house, since that fell out of fashion then under James I.
Yeah, certainly at Whitehall, yes.
Another banquet and performance location, which does date to when Shakespeare was performing plays, is Hampton Court Palace. The space where banquets were held is very open and does not contain a raised platform for a defined sort of stage area the way we think of some of Shakespeare's theaters. Julia, how was the Great Hall set up for feasting and for entertainment? What went on when they got this ready for Shakespeare and his troupe to arrive?
Right, so let me clarify that plays were not only performed in banqueting houses, they were very frequently performed in either great halls or in great chambers. The great chamber was the lobby at the very front of the private quarters of the monarch. And these were indoor permanent spaces. They would have been much warmer than the banqueting house, and they were very commonly the place where plays and masques were performed. To set up a great hall or a great chamber would have taken several days. We have records from the Office of the Revels about this process. It was called making ready, and it was also called appareling. And the biggest part of this was really building the seating. Building the stage was pretty simple, as a stage. But building the seating, these were like bleachers. They were raised seating so that the guests could be seated according to their order in the social hierarchy, and also so that they could have visibility, so that they could see what was being performed. And these were built out of timber. They had to be assembled. They had to be sturdy. They had to hold a lot of weight, because many, many people would be sitting on these, wearing their very heavy gowns and all that bling. So you didn't want the seating to collapse. That was a big deal, was assembling the seating. It was called appareling because they were also hanging tapestries. Tapestries were kept in storage as part of the Office of the Wardrobe, and then brought out and hung for special occasions. And these tapestries added warmth to the room. They also had scenes on them, so they added visual interest. The tapestries also were woven with gold and silver threads, and those threads would reflect that candlelight and amplify the glow of the room. They were really part of the lighting system of this pre-electrified era. And then the hanging of the lighting system itself. Those chandeliers were heavy. They had many candles. They had to be raised and lowered on pulleys. So it was quite an elaborate process to establish the lighting. All of that had to happen before a performance could occur.
Were the banquets coordinated with specific holidays? And can we see evidence of this part of Elizabethan culture show up in Shakespeare's plays?
Yeah, so the main performance times at court were Christmas, the Christmas season, and Shrovetide, although there were also performances at court for weddings, engagements, and diplomatic visits, which might or might not be coordinated with actual holidays, but largely during the winter months. So Shakespeare is performing at the Globe in the open air during the summer when there's natural light, and then he is performing at court to candlelight during the winter with those important winter holidays. And the Christmas season was associated, as it is today, with gift giving and with hospitality. So it's a time when the great houses and the palaces are opening up and inviting lots of people in for festivity. That's very, very clear in Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night, the title of the play, refers to the 12th night of Christmas, the Feast of the Epiphany. And there are references in that play, for example, to cakes and ale, which are traditional holiday foods. So you definitely have a very strong coordination, especially in the comedies, but also in the tragedies between the holiday cycle with its seasonal elements, also its church liturgical elements, its traditional festivities being connected with the song and dance, the plot, the ambiance of the plays. It's a huge part of Shakespearean drama is that element of festival.
Now, you alluded earlier to the food being a very coordinated event at the expense of taste on some occasions. And to match with the themes of the affair that was going on at where it was being served. Would Shakespeare's plays have also been coordinated along with the menu and other festivities of the event, such that the foods in the play might have matched up with what they ate at the event itself?
I don't think there would have been any real consultation between the chef and the steward who are setting up the menu and the performers. But you do have a reflection, let's say at the level of the holiday calendar or the ambiance of the play, where there is a sense in which the food that is being represented in the plays, in some sense, reflects the occasion. So let's take The Winter's Tale. The Winter's Tale, by the way, was performed at the Banqueting House at Whitehall under James. So that modern banqueting house that exists today was built after Shakespeare died. So in 1611 and 1613, we know that The Winter's Tale was performed in one of those more temporary banqueting houses with James I and his family present. The Winter's Tale has a pastoral festivity in it, a sheep shearing scene. And it's pretty clear that what's being cooked, I argue this in my book, is a white pot pudding, which was a sweet junket that was really associated with peasant festivities. Now, I doubt that you would have a white pot pudding served as either a banqueting course or at a feast because it was a pretty primitive dish. But it reflects that pastoral setting of the banqueting house itself as an indoor-outdoor space with these paintings and tapestries reflecting a kind of natural setting, and these fruits and distilled and conserved fruits being served, which really are very close to nature and don't require the kind of high level of service of the actual feast. So there's a paralleling there that's not literal, but that's very much at the level of atmosphere and symbol and how you would feel in the space. You might be dressed up in all of your bling and be a court noble lady, but when you see Perdita serving this homely meal, you feel like you too could be a shepherdess, that you too could, participate in the simple life that is kind of distantly represented in this banqueting course with its fruits and sweetmeats and connection to nature.
You clarified this earlier when you pointed out that great halls and great chambers were part of aristocratic homes, but I want to ask you to point out something about Elizabethan culture. This whole idea of having a structure separate from the main house, built specifically for the purpose of holding a banquet. Was this creation of a separate space for banquets something that Elizabeth I did unique to her, or was this an aspect of 16th century culture that extended beyond the highest levels of society? And how does it relate to what we think of today as a dining hall?
Yeah, the banqueting houses were definitely part of aristocratic culture more generally, and some of them were large enough to have some kind of theatrical performance in, but many of them were small. And when you're getting, away from the palaces, they would have been more intimate structures where maybe music would be performed, but the purpose was to really get away from the publicity and the exposure of where the feast was occurring and get into this more intimate after party feeling. We get a little bit of a sense of an after party in Romeo and Juliet, when the servants are preparing to eat the leftovers after hours. And that banqueting course had that kind of after party feeling to it. There were great houses that actually had banqueting turrets. So you would go up onto the roof through a special stairway, and then you would enter 5, 6, or more banqueting turrets. Each of them would be round, and a small group of the party, let's say 6 people, would have dessert in that banqueting turret. And perhaps there would be a musician there or some kind of performance, but not a play. And they would be able to see the estate. They'd be able to see the stars. It wouldn't be large enough to have a bunch of servants there, so it would be very private. Maybe flirtation, adultery, other kinds of activity might occur in this kind of intimate.
What happens in the turrets
space.
Stays in the turrets.
Exactly. So it's really fascinating to think of the banqueting course having this sort of separate architectural life and culinary life.
Julia's book calls attention specifically to marzipan as being a food designated for banquets, which Shakespeare seems to have known about since it's the food served at the Capulets banquet in Romeo and Juliet, although Shakespeare calls it marchpane. And in that play, Julia, what other foods, not specifically Romeo and Juliet, but at a banquet, what other foods were considered this kind of banqueting stuff? Aside from sugary things, what did they serve?
Well, they loved marzipan because it could be colored and shaped. So again, this relates to the sculptural interest in food that could create a landscape or communicate a message or otherwise be thematically connected to the drama and portraiture and gallery-like quality of the food. So marzipan could be shaped into flowers, animals, mythical beasts. They also liked making cookies shaped like letters, and that would allow you to spell out words, the names of people, or the word love, or something like that. There was also a whole sugar sculpture form called the sugar works. And the lady of the house might actually be involved in creating sculptures out of sugar. And this could be, a picture of Venus and Cupid, or it could be something more pastoral, flowers and trees, roses, and so forth. Gingerbread could also be shaped, as we have gingerbread boys today. Gingerbread was used in all sorts of shapes. They also loved preserved fruits. They would put up fruits in the summer and keep them for the winter season. And then those beautiful colored fruits would come out, and they would remind you of summer, right? It gets very dark in England in the winter. And so having this little bit of summer in the winter months was very, very powerful. And then they loved cordials. So the distillery was an important part of a great house or palace. It's where fruits were made into beverages, and they were seen as being medicinal as well as inebriating. So there was no shame in having your distilled beverage after dinner.
In addition to having expected foods and then, of course, the plays that we've mentioned, if we were standing there at Whitehall or one of these other great chambers for the presentation of a performance in celebration of the Christmas season, for example, in addition to marchpane and a play, what other aspects of a banquet could we expect to see and experience when we're there?
Well, a lot of music and dancing. So music could occur all throughout the feast, especially in between courses. Dancing would have occurred after the feast was over, and it would really kind of link very beautifully often to the play or masque, because plays and masques often end with dances, either as part of the action, for example, in a masque or at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, or there would be at the end of a play something called a jig. And a jig would be either some or all of the company coming out for a final musical number, often quite disconnected from whatever the plot and action of the play was. And so we have this dancing by the company that would be a kind of an invitation for all of the dressed up, beautiful people who are the guests to do their own dancing, perhaps for hours, after the play itself was over. So I'm very interested in how movement work inside the play, let's say a play that features social dancing among characters, as we see in Romeo and Juliet or in Much Ado About Nothing, how that social dancing is based on social dancing that occurs at court and then becomes almost a kind of like an education in social dancing, a reminder of the moves, for the people who are then going to dance in the time following the play.
I think I'm correct in saying that William Shakespeare would not have had the right station in life for his estate or home to have had one of these banqueting houses, but I'm curious whether he would have gone to, when he's there performing this play or leading the troupe, playing that role as the entertainer, would he have been allowed to attend the festivities? Would he have eaten the food or participated in these dances?
That's a great question. I mean, I really don't think he would have been at the feast. He would have, first of all, been busy getting ready for the performance after the feast. And the feasts were very hierarchical affairs, with whether you were seated, above the salt or below the salt, how close you were to the monarch, et cetera. It was a real, very, very carefully organized, the order of the seating. I think I can imagine him being part of that after party. Let's say that the company has performed their play. They've ended with a jig. We then flow into the banqueting course, to this drinking and eating of sweetmeats, to the social dancing. Would the company have been allowed to linger, to have a snack, to have a drink? I think that's possible. We don't have any records of that, so it's really hard to say for sure. But it was a less hierarchical, less rigid moment of the evening. And so you can certainly imagine perhaps some mixing around the edges at the beginning of that after party.
This is really a fun topic that I know we would love to dive into further and learn more about. And what are some of your favorite books or resources that you could recommend we use to learn more?
Oh, wow. Well, you might know this book called Shakespeare's Kitchen by Francine Segan. And these are Renaissance recipes for the contemporary cook. And so we have a lot of cookbooks, both printed and in manuscript, a huge area of academic interest and public interest. And she's taken those recipes and really modernized them so that you can actually have something like an Elizabethan feast with contemporary ingredients. So like simmered beef hodgepodge with sherry parsley sauce. Or from the dessert section, what does she have? Citrus tarts, baked apples with cinnamon stems, apple tarts with candied orange crust. She also has a list of menus at the back and stage directions for conversation, picnic suppers, all sorts of ideas for entertaining. I haven't actually done any of this yet, but I'd love to do this with some of my community groups to really have a Renaissance evening and cook some of these. For the more historically minded, I really recommend Banqueting Stuff by C. Ann Wilson. And this is really about the sweetmeats, that banqueting course, the architecture of the banqueting turrets and the banqueting houses. There are also recipes in this book. It's really a quite extraordinary study of this kind of lost art of the banqueting stuff as a separate course. And then if you like recipes and really looking at how they looked back in the day, there are a lot of great facsimiles and modern editions of 16th and 17th century cookbooks. English, but also French, Italian, is really a whole world. But one of them is Eleanor Fetaplace's receipt book. The word receipt was our word recipe. And it could mean both a recipe or a prescription, because cookery and pharmacy and medicine were all one thing. You didn't really separate them. And so there'll be recipes in here for cure-alls as well as for food as we would understand it. So there's really a lot of resources out there. The Folger Shakespeare Library is doing a great online project and a lot of programming around food. So you can also go to the Folger and look for some of their resources.
Now, Julia's book is also an excellent resource for this topic. Julia, tell us some more about your book and where we can find that.
Well, my book, Shakespeare Dwelling, came out in 2018, And it's really about the ambiance, atmosphere, architecture, sense of place and space in Shakespeare's plays. And it does have a final chapter called Room for Dessert, which is on the dessert course in Renaissance life and in Renaissance drama, including The Winter's Tale and Romeo and Juliet and Taming of the Shrew. And it was published by University of Chicago Press, and it is available in paperback.
We will definitely be linking to Julia's book and these other resources by Francine Segan and Eleanor Fetty Place. You can check out all of these in the show notes for today's episode. Julia, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, 2 years ago, I would have said Homer's Odyssey, which I think is just a perfect book, a perfect poem about hospitality, lots of food and drink, sacrifice and libation, parties large and small. But right now, I would say Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a Roman collection of mythological tales, incredibly influential on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. It's probably Shakespeare's favorite book. Parallel to, but competing with the Bible, because it's very different in mood. It's very sexy. It's full of people turning into plants and animals, gods falling in love and disguising themselves to seduce mortals. It's witty, it's tragic, it's full of living metaphors. It's super fun. I totally recommend it.
I always come away from Ovid's Metamorphoses mad at Venus because she's so incredibly vindictive, but but you'll definitely be well set up on your deserted island with that choice for sure. Well, Julia, I know we're excited to know what's next for you. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm working on a book on Shakespeare and virtue. The word virtue, kind of like the word banquet, had a very different set of meanings than it has now. We think of virtue as meaning sort of the straight and narrow path, and it certainly had a moral sense. But virtue is much broader. It really meant power and capacity. And plants had virtues as well as people. So someone who was working in the kitchen was learning how to use the virtues of the herbs and fruits and other materials that they were using either for healthcare or for diet and food. And I believe that theater develops certain virtues and capacities in us, virtues like courage, like trust, like hope, like faith, and that those virtues are kind of full body experiences. They're not just about a kind of a moral code, but they're about how we interact as complete human beings with our environments and with each other. So that's really the subject of my current book project.
Well, I will look forward to seeing that come to fruition. Please make sure you keep us updated on that. Julia Lupton, thank you so much for being here today and taking us inside Banqueting House to explore Shakespeare's plays as they were performed there. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you for being here.
Fabulous. Thanks for having me.
To join in on this conversation with your thoughts about banquets in Shakespeare's England, be sure to check out today's show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your comments, but there's extra history over there and links to the resources Julia recommends, along with links to her latest book where you'll want to check out the entire chapter on Room for Dessert that focuses on the banqueting course at 16th century feasts. Find all of these resources and bonus history content all about Shakespeare at CassidyCash.com/episode 93. That's CassidyCash.com/EP93. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.